everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track's Book Club for summer 2022. I'm your host, Rob Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hi, it's me, Jackie.
You sang so long, your mic cut out.
Yeah.
And it's me, Diana. Hello.
And it's me, Alan, the book club guy.
Good, I was waiting.
Alan.
That's right. We've got the fearsome foursome here because this is our patron-only book club for the summer months. At some point, I think you might hear this on our free feed, but that's way in the future. This is only for you special folks who subscribe at our $10 and up level. We are discussing a full-length book right here, right now. And Diana, what is that book that we will be discussing today?
Oh my goodness. Well, let me tell you.
It's like, gotta vamp. We don't remember. Read that book, guys, quick.
Well, first of all, I just want you to know that I prepared for this by doing several different things.
Okay.
First of all, I read Street Gang, but it turned out that was all about the history of Sesame Street.
Not what we're doing tonight.
Right. Then I listened to all of the albums that we owned by The Streets.
Okay.
But it turns out that that's like a British rap band from the early 2010s.
It's not. It's just one guy.
It's just one guy.
It's just Mike.
It's just one guy.
What was that? Grand Hook on for free. That's an amazing album.
So we did that. And then I went back and I watched a lot of Community episodes because I really wanted to be streets ahead.
Okay.
But none of those were actually related.
It just left you streets behind.
To this book, because this book is called Street Data.
Did you play any video games while you were preparing for this, Diana?
I did. I played a little bit of GTA.
I would assume you'd say Street Fighter.
Oh, and Street Fighter. Sorry. We didn't plan that one. Okay. But no. It turned out this book was related to absolutely none of those topics. It was called Street Data, a next generation model for equity pedagogy. I'd say pedagogy. And school transformation by Safir and Dugan. And and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Excellent. So the theme for this month, and then this book was voted on by our patrons, was equity, the idea of equity. So we had How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. We had White Fragility by, I don't want to say D'Angelo. I'm forgetting her name. Robin D'Angelo. And then Street Data, which was a book that I had found when, honestly, I was like, what's a good book that's probably somewhat behavior analytic, that has to do with data, that has to do with equity, and I need a third one. And this one came up, and so I sort of shortlisted it on our Amazon list. And then I had a colleague, a consulting psychiatrist to the district I work in, who said, oh, Rob, you're going to love this book, Street Data. I recommend it. I know you're going to love it. And she's known me for a number of years. So if she says she thinks I'm going to love a book, I assume that she's, not just like making it up. And so I was like, all right, well, that one's definitely on the list. So that was one of our three books. And
she said,
it won
don't
the poll.
Take my word for it.
It was LeVar Burton, consulting psychiatrist. And that is how we've come to talk about Street Data, because, certainly it has equity in the title. We're behavior analysts, so we're all about data. So it seems like it's going to be a match made in heaven, right? Well, stay tuned, folks. We have to talk about the book to decide if that is the case. There's not a lot of like really exciting background because this is a very recent book. It was released last spring in March 2021. And I believe the authors have, Jackie, did one of the authors, Dr. Safir, had she written any books before? I think we were mentioning.
Yes, she has written a book before. And that's one of my pet peeves, when somebody writes a book and then they frequently cite their previous book. Like in a book that I wrote already, what was it called? The Active Listener?
The listening leader. Listening leader.
She mentions it one times.
How many times? You cut out, Jackie. How many times was it?
1 million.
1 million. Wow.
I actually counted it's like 24 times.
Okay. I thought it was 3. So we have our two authors. But before we get into kind of a little bit of background on the book and then start talking about the book, just initial thoughts going into the book and initial thoughts as you were reading the book. Alan, would you like to, why don't you start us off, Alan? Like, what were you kind of thinking when you found out this was going to be the book club book?
Well, I was somewhat familiar with the book just from keeping my pulse on the things. And I have to say, overall, the message of the book is very like good. It's very current. It's like the opening sort of like shots fired. They talk about settler colonialism and a lot of the issues that are very prescient right now. But it also sort of feels like this is a conversation that's been going on since like No Child Left Behind was enacted. And it's just sort of, it's nice that it repeats old arguments and puts it within a new context, but it also does repeat a lot of old arguments. So I was kind of conflicted about the utility of this book as I sort of got into it. Hopeful, but... And again, it has its place, but I think from a behavior analyst point of view, it's something I've heard a lot about.
Okay, I'm going to be very curious to see kind of what everyone's take. Because Alan, you and I both have a history working in public schools, and then as behavior analysts as well. Whereas Jackie and Diana, you are more about the behavior analysis with some knowledge of public schools. So I'm curious to see if we had different takeaways from the book from the perspective of an educator who's a behavior analyst who knows about education. I'm kind of curious to see if we're coming up with some different messages or take homes at the end of it.
Yeah.
And Alan, I'm going to say right now, if it's something that is information you already know, like Diana says, you're always streets ahead on this stuff. So it may be important that people, who are streets behind get this information. Because when you usually,
stationary on the street.
Yeah, we're just hanging out. We loiter. We're street loiterers. You're streets ahead on this stuff.
And I think this will be an interesting conversation because we are all educators, but we're educators in different ways, right? So Alan, you and Rob both have a background specifically in education, and Jackie and I do not, but we're currently educators at the graduate school level. So for me, there were interesting takeaways from this that could be applied in that setting. And that may or may not have been the point of the book, which I guess we'll come to.
Sure. Jackie, how about you?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I found it hard to figure out who the book was written for. So I kept, as I'm reading it, I kept like ripping hats off and putting hats on. Like, am I reading this as a behavior? Like, how would I read this just as a behavior analyst? How would this apply just to me? How am I reading this as a professor? How would I read this as like a school administrator? How would I read this as the teacher? What could I do at each of these things? So I think that for me was a little confusing. It was hard for me to kind of follow my own path. Like, here are my main takeaways, right? Because I kept feeling that I was like ripping my hats off and switching them up. So I think again, the information I think is needed. I do think we need some change in our public education system, right? But I think it would have been a little helpful to be like, if you're a teacher, here, right? If you're an administrator, here. I love books that do that, and I was looking for that. And maybe I would have found it more if I dove and spent more time in those discussion questions, but I don't know because some of them didn't feel like, as a behavior analyst, I'm writing this as a public school behavior analyst, I was pretending to be one, right? What could I do at this level? And sometimes I felt like not much, right? Because I'm not in the position to make change.
Yeah.
Right.
Diana, I know you mentioned a little bit in terms of your own perspective as a behavior analyst who has come into education at a different level than the kind of target audience of this book. But did you have any other kind of thoughts going in when you started reading it, while you were reading it?
I think that the book comes in very strong, right? And I could tell that the authors are very excited at the beginning of the book to get out all of those points that they wanted to make. And I think I've done maybe enough reading in this area that I wasn't shocked or surprised by the points that were being brought up. But like Alan said, they are very new and prescient points, the way that she's presenting them. And if I had never read that before, those initial chapters may have been, really transformative in one's thinking, right? When you encounter that book, that's the one that you're like, oh, I haven't thought about it this way before, right? Like that becomes one of your favorite books, right? So I could see for someone who hasn't read that yet, like the first few chapters of this book could be one of your favorite books, right? So I thought that it started really strong. And if I maybe hadn't had the background, I would have been like really blown away by some of it. And then as we went on, I was like, yep, I got it. I am good on the points that you're making. I got where this is going, and I think I've arrived there with the authors. Mm-hmm. So for me, the bang for your buck is definitely in the first chapters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say one thing I appreciated about the book, both behavior analytically and in how the book was written, is they gave us some like points. Like, here are the things you could do. It's like at the last chapter, I think, like, here are the things that you need to do. Stay focused, right? These are things that we as behavior analysts would agree with most of the time, right? Use salient cues, make sure that the consequences are in place and you have relevant stimulus control, right? Promote collaboration with the people that are doing it, right? So when they're talking about the administration and the teachers, like, don't just say this is something else you have to do, but, get that buy-in, make it a learning opportunity where reinforcement is inherently present, right? And then I think that they did that throughout the book, right? So I think they used so many visuals that maybe some of the visuals weren't necessary.
Oh, I love the visuals though.
But I love the visuals, right? So I thought that they presented like, if you don't love words, right, and you like to see things in a visual way,
but you find yourself reading a book,
right? Well, it's pretty textbooky, right? So there's a glossary, right, which I also loved. I love myself a good glossary. I think it grounds everyone. I wish the glossary was always in the beginning, to be honest. I wish all books had glossaries in the beginning so I could understand what everyone's thinking first and then dive into the book. But so I think, I loved that they had those visuals there. I thought it really tied together their points. I liked the worksheets that they had in there. They're like, here's what we're talking about. Here are the worksheets. What I wish they would have done one step further is like, here's an application, right? That's something that I would have loved to see a little bit more of. They kind of did those with the case studies and vignettes, but I would have liked more of those after they said, here's what you're doing. Here's how you can collect street data. Here's a worksheet. Now here's an exact example, right?
Yeah, I agree there, Jackie. It definitely, there wasn't any one chapter where I was left feeling like, I don't know what they're talking about in this chapter. Like, I always felt like, oh, I get it. And I kind of have an idea of what this would look like in practice. Some chapters better than others actually giving you the anecdotes or giving you the scripted conversations. There are actually a couple good videos and links on here.
Yes, but there are video links too.
Yeah, but as a whole, I agree. I kind of felt like this was the sort of book that if you just read it thinking, and now I'm ready to help my team use street data, you're still missing some pieces, or you're jumping into, and maybe that's part of what the book's saying. You're jumping into a complex situation rather than a complicated situation in which you don't know the outcome. But I also felt like not only do I not know the outcome, I'm not 100% sure I'm going to be using these tools correctly. And depending on your team makeup, the diversity of your team, you may be stuck falling into some of the traps and tropes of inequitable teacher behavior when you think you're doing everything correct for equity, when in reality, all you're doing is sort of going about the problem with slightly different vocabulary, but in the same inherently biased and racist, white supremacist, educational lens that we have here in America. So there was a little more I wanted. I almost felt like I wanted there to be more workbook activities or more guided practice activities to jump on, because the book sets itself up as different sections. Section 1 really talking about the idea of street data and equity. Section 2 getting into more what is street data. Section 3 then kind of jumps into here's some ways you can use reflection as a teacher, and then section 4 is a little bit more administrative, but not exactly. And it doesn't quite give me everything I want to feel like, all right, and implement, which, is not necessarily fair to make the authors, change my whole district with their one book.
The format, which, and this is, I think, a positive, especially if you were reading it in conjunction, like in a class, would be the nurture effect. It has that same setup of like, this could be useful to people that are learning this content and learning the context of all of this. So that is a bonus. And I think that what I disliked about the nurture effect, this book really makes up for in terms of like talking about like the current situation, not sort of like this is the state of behaviorism and behavioral science from the last 30 years and what we can do about it. This one felt very specific to some of the problems we're seeing in schools now. I think, and if you really liked those early chapters that do talk about sort of the context of, you know, like we live in a system that has some very awful biases toward large groups, large portions of the population.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot of, there's a great book called $2 a Day by Luke Schaefer and Catherine Eden, where they look at like sort of vignettes of people that were really adversely affected by changes to the welfare system post-Reagan, under Reagan, Clinton, and to some extent President George W. Bush. And I that lots of different portions of this book sort of took me there of like, so that was the welfare system and the changes that were made and how it affected these families. And look at those changes that were made to the public school system and how they have really tanked us in a lot of ways and underserved these families. So I think that in sort of if you wanted sort of a broader reading, this book fits nicely into sort of a spectrum between those other two books.
Alan, you've always got good book references. I need to stop trying to catch up on my Star Wars canon novels and really go beyond a little more. Or Disney nonfiction. I got a lot of those. All right. So really quickly about the authors, then we're going to get into the book itself. We'll talk a little bit about some of the early chapters, probably in more depth, and then we'll be a little lighter as we get to the sort of part where, honestly, if you're not actively practicing this book, you can read it, you'll get some ideas. But if this is a book you're like, I'll just read this and I'll know all about equitable data, you probably won't know it any more than if you're like, I'm in the self-reflection stage of bias. Like, that's great. That's an important stage. But if that's all you ever do, you ain't doing anything to support equity work long term. You know, you got a couple days, you can coast on that. Oh, okay. So we've got two authors, Dr. Shane Safir and Dr. Jamila Dugan. And Dr. Safir is, because I think, the primary author. They sort of broke down who wrote what chapter, and she wrote, I guess, more chapters, but they're both co-authors on the book. She had a background in history and then went into education and then sort of went into more of the administrative role. She worked in the California school system, and specifically, I think, the San Francisco's June Jordan School for Equity, which from her bio is a cutting-edge national model, which was quoted as having beaten the odds and supporting the success of low-income students of color. So she's had multiple years as an administrator in a school which was focusing on equitable behavior. She wrote another book, I think. Jackie, is that right? You were saying something about it. Maybe she mentions it once, twice.
She sure does. The Listening Leader, Creating the Conditions for Equitable School Transformation.
Yes. And she does give you enough information in the book about what you could learn from the listening leader, which is more about the idea of building kind of relational capital with others and then listening. So some of the later chapters, I think, really are pulling from that work that she'd done.
That's where I think it was most heavily cited.
Yes.
In those later chapters. Yeah, Alan.
Well, I was like, and if you wanted, I think if you wanted to be generous about her mentioning it, you could. I think she may also be avoiding some self-plagiarism.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
In that she's really drawing, like she's sort of wrapping up this book and saying, I've kind of been making these points. And
oh, yeah.
I really, just because I did scan the other book and she does talk about it to some extent. So not to slap down, she does mention it an awful lot, but just as a credit that, good not to self-plagiarize.
That's true. That's true.
But it also feels a little weird when you're like, read this book and this book and this book and this book that I wrote.
Yeah. And then Street Data sort of came about by taking a lot of the practices from the administrative history and from her consulting and to, it kind of became like a pandemic right. It seemed like she talks a little about in the preface as taking those ideas and putting them into this book. And our other author, Dr. Jamila Dugan, is a teacher and professional of color who had a bad history in the public school system. So many of the inequitable practices that are written about in this book in terms of speaking to everyone achieving and then acting like students of color probably won't achieve. There's that subtext. That was her learning experience as a young student, to the point that she actually was expelled from school because the school just was not providing her what was needed. And we're seeing a lot of her behavior as being, inappropriate. I kind of reading between the lines in some of her bio. And then she went to a different school. It was a Pan-African school that focused on identity development and education for Black liberation, which she said really turned her whole educational framework around, and then led to her work as a teacher in Washington, D.C., where she was nominated for Teacher of the Year one year, where she worked on implementing international baccalaureate programs, Mandarin immersion when she moved out to California to be a teacher and administrator out there. And now at this point, she, I think, does more kind of that similar idea of she's working more as kind of a consultant and a leader rather than working directly in schools, I believe. And she was the primary researcher on the listening leader. So I'm guessing when she moved out to California, that's when her and Dr. Dugan and Dr. Safir kind of got together. They worked on the listening leader a little bit together, to some extent together. It's a little unclear. She was a primary researcher is all I could find. And then led to the creation of their co-authoring of Street Data. And I just have to say that Dr. Dugan, I wasn't quite entirely sure. I didn't get a chance to look it up. Her sections I felt were much more sort of to the point in a very helpful way. Again, Dr. Safir, I want to just be completely clear that what she contributes is really great in terms of just a framework and sort of thinking and trying to be concise about very difficult topics. But Dr. Dugan sections are like really hit home to sort of what my experience in public schools and the inequitable systems in place. Mm. Yeah, I'm wondering how much of that, Alan, do you think might have been because Dr. Dugan spent more time as a teacher and had a learning history that was probably similar to many of the students she was teaching in the DC school systems versus Dr. Safir, who seems like she focused more on the administrative side of things and writes this book from more of that 10,000 mile view to some extent of like, you have to learn these terms. And more of what she was talking about was sort of for like the white educator, less so than necessarily educators of color, just because of her own experience.
Well, I would just be rather succinct and say that Dr. Safir is trying to use CRT in a way that like this is what critical race theory looks like without going on about it. Like these are important ideas for shaping our understanding. And she's rather upfront about that, which I think is both a plus of the book, but it also it's kind of frustrating because it's like, oh, if only this had been like 10 years earlier before we're sort of reacting to the anti-CRT rather than like, you can tell that she's really trying to cut off the anti-CRT conversation and say, no, like some of these ideas are very important to our understanding of the current school system. But it feels like we're a couple years too late to some extent.
Oh.
And it could just be, again, that she doesn't have as much experience in schools. So.
Yeah. I mean, they definitely came from different backgrounds. But I did appreciate that they broke out who wrote what chapter, because I think it did lend itself to, it was kind of fun. I don't want to be dismissive of the tone, but it was sort of fun to have two authors. And then there's one who wrote just one of the chapters was a third author. They just had like a guest writer. It was nice to get a different voice. Like, you kind of get tired of like, I'm reading the same shit, and then you got a different voice. And they didn't try to hide that, and they didn't try to change it. Like, this definitely felt like a book that they worked on together, but when it was time to write, they were writing as themselves, which I found very interesting for a book that otherwise, like Jackie said, was kind of textbook-like in many ways.
I don't really know much about the public school system. So if people are reading this, I wouldn't know that they were a couple years behind. Right? I'd be like, oh, this is revolutionary because I don't know. I don't even have a kid in the public school system right now. Like, the public school system is foreign. It's just a place where there's schools, right? And I'm paying my taxes and people go to school. But I don't have any, I don't consult the public schools. And so when I'm reading this, so like other people will probably be like, not know that this has already been discussed and already been talking about. because it was kind of new to me.
Public schools are weird, and maybe just for folks listening to this who also don't have a lot of experience with public schools, because it does seem like, oh, it's a big, block of topics, right? And just like in behavior analysis, it's kind of, you're a teacher, you got to learn the same teacher stuff, and then you go in and you teach, and that's what you do. And even in a state like Massachusetts, we're, for at least three of us, we're in Massachusetts, which fortunately always scores really, really high in education. But you would think that means then whenever you read something cutting edge, all of the Massachusetts schools must be doing it. And then even within our state, depending on what town you go to, they're going to have vastly different experience. And sometimes you're surprised. I know I've been surprised where I've heard about schools that I know are really low performing schools that have done so badly that they've gone into receivership by the state. And I'll hear the teachers working there, they're using the cutting edge materials. Where I'll talk to a colleague who's, say, in like an affluent, well-off district who has never heard of half of these things because they haven't had to, because the makeup of their population is such that, honestly, equity hasn't been as much of a problem due to their demographics. And when I say it hasn't been as much of a problem, it hasn't been a primary problem due to the number of students who are probably white and in high socioeconomic classes. I know that's not all of a district, but that's enough of it. It's a majority of a district. So when we talk about a public school district,
it's not a topic.
Yeah,
it's been presented.
Yes,
right?
But your mileage may vary. And how those districts decide to tackle subjects like equity are going to be very different depending on the makeup of the population, how well they're doing on state tests. So you could be in a district that you think is cutting edge, and some of this may be relatively new material. Certainly, if you're a behavior analyst, you may have never seen half of this material, even working in public schools.
And that brings me to another important book, a point about why I did what I did appreciate about this book, and that is that a lot of what they criticize in this book a decade, 2 decades ago was the cutting edge equitable approach that was intended to be. And I think that we as behavior analysts need to be aware, because we contributed to some of the systems that they criticize, like the curriculum-based assessment structure. And I think that was another frustrating part. It's just blame us. We need, we're some of the experts that contributed to these problems, and that scripted curriculums, it's supposed to be equitable for lower performing students or students that need more assistance and students with, in the special education system. But it's turned out not to be equitable because it's been poorly implemented and without fidelity, and it's been sort of taken over by administration and state political interests. So I think that's another important point, is that what was equitable or seemed or was intended to be equitable was equitable within a system that equity couldn't really exist, and we exacerbated problems.
So, Alan, you're speaking exactly that. That was my thought process throughout this whole book. I felt like I would read a chapter and I would agree with everything in the chapter, and I would also disagree with half the things in the chapter. And I found myself, at a real crisis of, am I disagreeing because I think these ideas are wrong? Am I disagreeing because I think these ideas are wrong from the lens of a white male teacher or educator who's benefited from this system and hasn't finished their own self-reflection on the, just the kind of the inherent racism in these systems? And how will I know the difference? So many of the topics brought up in this book, I was very much in support of. And then I find myself scared about the idea of implementation. And it was a lot to say, am I scared because I worry this won't work? Or am I scared because it's just not going to work within a context I have decided arbitrarily, which is every context to some extent, is not the right one because it's not the one I know? And am I just being very short-sighted in that? So in that regard, this book is depending on who you are, if you're coming from a background like mine, I think it can be very hard to hear some of this. But I think we should take that as exciting. We should be excited that there are other ideas out there. And I think when you look at, say, our ethical code, much of what's suggested in this book in terms of looking at learner strengths, looking at socially valid measurement systems is very in line with what we as behavior analysts should be doing, rather than, no, this is the curriculum that is the best curriculum Ergo, it is the only curriculum. And if you're not doing well at it, it's because you were not a good student or you're failing, rather than, well, there might be a reason that you're not engaged with this curriculum. And it might have to do with our structures, our racist structures. It might have to do with a different background that we're not taking into account. It might have to do with it's not of value to you as a learner, but you could learn the same material in a different way, learn the exact same material, but we're not presenting it in that way. We're not giving you that choice or voice. So I think there was a lot in here. I know I had a lot of fun reading this book, but again, I think if you're not at that point in your own educational idea, you could probably read this book and be very angry at the end of it, which would be sad. But, again, everyone reads books differently, I guess.
Well, I think that if your own personal experience has been one of academic success within the types of educational systems that we have established, then it can feel threatening for someone to say, well, those systems by which you've been measuring your success may not be the best reflection, right? Or it's only a reflection if you have this particular history. And that's something you have to sit with and be able to expand upon, which you did, Rob. So, but I think it's okay to recognize that within yourself and with your own personal lived experience. I also think that our background as behavior analysts can bring us into this conversation in kind of a threatened position as well, right? Because we have been taught to base our definitions of success or positive outcome, right? Or doing good, which is what we all want to be here to do, is do good things, on these same types of, really clear, observable, measurable outcomes. And that's not to say that those may not be important ways to measure, but we need to think about why we're measuring them in that way. Who decided that that's how we're going to measure something, right? And guess what? It's often the same group of people that benefit from that measurement system that devise that measurement system. And are there, limitations or narrow perspectives of success that we are defining with that measurement system? And can we look at other broader ways of measuring positive outcome that are potentially less objective and more subjective instead? So we as behavior analysts have to, I think, also kind of take that in, right? And not necessarily feel threatened by that. But we as a field are at this pivotal moment of taking what we understand about objective measurement and also looking at the benefits of subjective measurement. So it's a good time for us as a field, I think, to be taking in a book like this.
All right.
I'm not gonna lie, I did feel a little threatened when she's like, "You don't need that data," and I was like,
"But I love my data."
Well, Jackie, you and I, yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jackie. Sorry.
Yeah, and we had this conversation before. I'm like, we can do them together, can't we? We can use these together. Like, I was trying in my heart of hearts to like make a compromise, being like, I love data. I think it can be helpful, but I also think it's not the end all be all. But that's not really the point she's making. I think Rob was right, because I was like, can't we do both? Can't we use street data and then can't we use the assessment data, right, to guide our overall decisions? If we're using the street data to then inform our assessments, will that then give us the data that can show global improvement, right? Because I don't want to just subjectively say everyone's doing much better, but then really no one's done better because everyone just feels better because we're talking about it more, but there's not actual behavioral change.
Yeah.
Right.
I think if the data that is currently being used, so looking at sort of our state assessments or our national assessments or sort of our worldwide math and science scores, if every year we show that all of our students were making huge improvements, regardless of demographic data, there's no difference. Everyone's improving every year. Everyone's in the top percentiles. Then this wouldn't be the conversation we would need to have. And then everyone's getting jobs and everyone's scoring high on QOL questionnaires. Then it wouldn't really matter what data we were taking. The issue becomes that's not the case. And I think, jumping into the preface of the book, this is a pandemic, right? where the authors themselves were saying, my kids were starting to hate school and then pandemic. And I found that when they had new things to do that weren't just the same old, they seemed to like school a little bit better. And really coming back to what, like Alan said, is not a new idea, but why are educational systems the way they are? It's not because they were perfected in the early 1900s and there's no need to change them. It's because they seemed to work pretty well for a lot of people in the early 1900s. Not for everybody, but they worked for the people who had the loudest voices then. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And at some point, we all have to sit back and say, I think some of this stuff is really broken. We need to do things differently. And what if one of the steps was, let's stop looking at what she refers to as the satellite data. It doesn't help us make decisions. It sort of just tells us how things are bad, and start looking at the causes of student success, student difficulties, student opinion on work, and use that information. That's kind of, loosely some of that street data to make better educational decisions. And there's a great quote I love in the preface. It's on page 4. What is the purpose of education anyway? Do we teach and lead to simply reproduce reality, or will we teach and lead to transform it? And, it brings to mind, like when you read about the people who learned to be doctors in the 1800s, they didn't have a great doctor curriculum in the 1800s. They just do stuff and watch people. And I'm not saying that all of that behavior was totally ethical and appropriate, but there was a sense of, we have to learn how this works. So let's do things that allow us to learn what we think is helpful, rather than here's your published curriculum, you have to follow it. There are pros and cons to having standardized curricula, but I think there's a time and a place for everything. Sort of like what you were saying, Jackie, with that data we were talking about. I don't think either of these authors would say you can never use any of the data systems we've used in the past. I think the question would be more, why do you need to use those data systems particularly? And are they telling us information that is helping students with making choices about their education that will benefit them for the rest of their lives?
Well, and I think it's in the area of around page 52, she really talks about listening to students and families, especially when their voices are hard to hear. And I think that goes back also to that feeling of being threatened, us as professionals, and that we've spent a long time learning about these systems that are supposed to be helpful.
Right.
And we're being told that, no, the data that you're making me take is intrusive. It's not that useful. It doesn't guide me in a very practical way. It doesn't help me make these student lives better. But hey, here is types of data I can take. Some of the data that the data collection practices that you as professionals have handed to schools can be part of that. But this is where teachers, people who have been expert, who have trained and worked for sometimes decades in these systems, to say, hey, my expertise says this is useful data. So then it's on us to go back and be okay, so, all right, how can we help teachers and families and students use this data and take data in ways that, meets our arbitrary standards, or is closer to having a broader social validity, if you like. But yeah, it's really on us to to turn it off and listen, and then be okay, because we're being asked to help with the book like this. I think that is sort of the tone. It's just listen, don't just keep handing me curriculum-based measurement and scripted curricula.
Yeah.
Right.
That doesn't help.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
Hey everyone, just want to pause the episode real quick to give you the first of our secret code words, and it is united. U-N-I-T-E-D. Could it be united like our United States, or united in our desire to make equitable public school systems? Or could it have been a board game that had the word united that I happen to be sitting near? I guess you'll never know, and I guess it doesn't matter. You just need to remember our first book club code word is united. Now back to the episode. So one of the organizing principles of the book is every chapter has a guiding principle and every chapter has a core stance. And they're all, we were talking about visuals earlier, they're all laid out in a really handy table at the start of the book. And I did find even for the chapters I was either having a challenge with, either it was a challenge sort of kind of like you were saying, Al, this sort of personal, like I'm taking it personally, like how dare you, that's my data you're talking about, that's my Western empiricism, you're critiquing authors. I found going back to the guiding principle and going back to the core stances really did help with kind of some of the steps that they talk about later in the book in terms of assuming positive intent. You know, the goal is not to make me feel bad. The goal is to help me, reach my goal, which is to support learners, support families. That's why I got into this job, not to tell people information that I think is right. That's fun and all, but if it's not helping the people I'm purporting to support, it's not useful. And starting with the idea of holism in the first chapter. And I think the first chapter for some folks might be the hardest to read, and especially if you're, coming at it from the idea of, empiricism, which is key to a lot of what we do in our field, and that much of the science and the science practice that we as Westerners do is going to have an inherent bias in it. And that when we're focused on using information to give us the answers that we want to know, we're missing a lot of what makes a person in terms of cognitive skills, and cognitive development is an important component of us as humans. But we're also sort of forgetting the idea of our identity as a person in a community. We're forgetting the physical needs, potentially, of the individual, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling supported. Those emotional needs as well. And then even the idea of the kind of the spiritual. And this was not, meant to be kind of religious spiritual, but just the idea of what is your purpose? What is your life's purpose? And that if we're not focusing on all aspects of our students, all those, the cognitive, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual, we're missing a lot of what makes that student and what is going to lead them to success down the road. And from our perspective, many of us have spent most of our careers focusing on the cognitive and maybe then the physical and hopefully some of the emotional, but probably not necessarily the spiritual, or maybe we have to some extent, but we haven't necessarily thought of it as a holistic student so much as we're here to help in this one area and this one area only, which might be what we've been hired to do, might be what our client wants. So certainly from our perspective may be very appropriate. However, as an educator, it's hard not to take into account all of the aspects of the student. And many of our Western techniques are not doing that. They're just not developed to do that.
And I'm just going to say what's beautiful about this approach, that this is all about intersectionality, which they talk about later, that if you take this approach that they're taking that is informed by an anti-racist, anti-sexist, truly inclusive and practical model, all of those questions, which are really in the book oriented at thinking about people of color, also apply to people with significant needs, and whether that's special education or could be language, and people that that are experiencing homelessness. All of those boxes are important to check for everybody. And so it's like everybody's well-being is improved when we consider all of these questions, which the current system does not.
Mm-hmm.
So
there was another quote. I sort of liked how every chapter ended with some guiding questions. And I didn't think all of them were necessarily relevant for our group because we're not necessarily a group of public school educators, all of us, and they didn't all come from a behavior analytic lens. But I did pick ones that I thought could be relevant for our own equitable work as behavior analysts or as educators who are behavior analysts as well. There was another quote that I liked, and Jackie and Dan, I'd like to get your kind of opinion on it, or it's a reflection question, right? Alan, you can too.
I didn't know there would be homework.
It's not. Well, you read the book, so that was the homework. Alan, you certainly could jump in on this one too, but I think you and I expected to probably, as the most public school background, probably to do most of the talking already. So for all our talk of, I got to look on that one. Sorry, I didn't mean it.
Huh? No, I'm just ready for the question.
Oh, okay. That's your ready look. I'm sorry.
Long preface here.
All right. If it doesn't last 5 minutes, it's not a Rob question.
Yeah, you're out of runway.
For all our talk,
we're aware.
Wait, Rob, what page are you on?
I'm going to read you the quote. It's at the end of chapter 1. I don't remember
in his
the
notes.
page.
He doesn't have the page.
I don't have that page number. For all our talk of being student-centered, we have bought into a success paradigm that robs many children of their voices, marginalizes their gifts, and prioritizes measurement and incremental improvement over learning and transformation. And then the question is, what are your reactions to this quote? Agree, disagree, or something in between?
That was on page 12.
Thank you.
Since you are reading it directly from the book.
I put quotes. They're air quotes.
Air quotes.
Knowing the page number, you still have to answer the question.
I'm probably somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
Because I, like you said before, I don't disagree that all of these things are important, right? But I also want us to be able to determine as a group through, agreement that we have produced some type of meaningful change / education for this person. And I think what those decisions are, as far as what we're going to teach and what's going to be meaningful education, should be determined through individualized discussion and certainly contextualization of that person's experience within all of the other very important variables that they're experiencing. But the end result still needs to be a way for us to measure that and look at that outcome. And when I also bring in the fact that we often work with a population that is more limited in how they can tell us what that impact may be for their educational experience, that for me makes it all that more important that we have well defined what those outcomes are and how we're going to measure.
Mm.
So I'm going to agree with Diana, but I'm also going to add that if I had to pick an agree or disagree, I would pick the agree, because as behavior analysts, we know that not all behavior analysts are doing a great job.
Sure.
Right? Not all teachers have the training and expertise to do a good job. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I when I read this and when I was thinking about this chapter specifically, I was thinking about all the times that I was in an IEP, right, at a public school, and they're like, we ran an FBA, and then we made this data, we made this treatment, but it had nothing to do with the FBA, right? They just then added a treatment in place. And so I think the data may have, was it like the cart comes before the horse? I think I got that one right.
Yes.
Right? Is that we may have been relying too much on data without training the people that are using the data what the data are for.
Mm-hmm.
Great
right?
point.
And what we should do with them. So I think here, right, especially children on the margins, right, they have probably not been taught advocacy skills. They have, like, even our kids with intellectual disabilities, right? We've not done a good job teaching them to be advocates to themselves. We've not taught them when it's okay to talk out, right? And in some schools, it may not be, especially now in the area, like, think about Florida. I'm not going to, that's all I'm going to say. Florida, right? Just think about Florida right now. And some
like Disney World and how much fun we love those rides.
Florida right now, right? So I think the data that, not all data are great data, right?
Yeah.
And not all data are useful data. And so when I think about it in that way, I would 100% agree with her statement here, or their statement, right? Because I can't remember if both of them wrote this chapter. Because I'm not sure we always do a great job of training the people that matter to take the data that matter and then apply that data appropriately. Right? I hope we do. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I think your example of the FBA brings up a great point, that the book, I didn't feel parsed out that there are multiple sources of data that schools have to contend with, and things like ABA and PBIS, these student-centric, observation-centric approaches are one set of data, but I really feel the criticism is aimed at Harcourt, Pearson, like these huge companies that are sucking millions or billions of dollars out of public education by giving data to make data-driven solutions. And yet there's always new stuff. It's like, well, if your old stuff were quality, like, why do we need things need to get revised. Don't get me wrong. But there comes a point where it's like, it feels like it's evergreening, but instead of pharmaceuticals, it's, standardized assessments. And I think it's that standardized assessment approach to data, as you see as being from like No Child Left Behind, is what they really are digging at.
Yeah.
And so like the street data model is much friendlier to FBAs and those types of assessments. And I think so I think that's where we're not as threatened. Yeah. Like it's more of the big publishers,
standardized.
Yeah, the standardized, and even, like, how many times have you looked at the AFLs or AFLs or the ABLs or the VB-MAP or PEAK, and you're just like, is this really useful to this client and this family? Right. But I'm supposed to do it all. So even our field does have to contend with that to some extent.
Yeah.
But I think that if, as a behavior analyst, this book's make you uncomfortable, you can ground yourself in that, like the type of data that they're valuing is data that our data, sorry, just because you're those types of professors, is data that we actually can be comfortable with, of, that is very student-centric, family-informed. It doesn't have to be the standardized types of data.
Can I just make one more point about that, too? Is when I was reading this, I was like, yeah, we don't want group designs. We don't want to do this. Let's be individualized. So I was like, yes, I totally agree with you. We're not doing a great job. But then I was like, but damn those group designs, where I think group designs to be, in my own personal opinion, I think there are some questions that lend themselves to a group design, right? I don't think we should focus solely on single subject, but I think what they're saying really aligns nicely to that single subject design, right? Because we're looking for change. Hopefully that change is change that, is socially valid for the client. But I also felt that too. I wanted to be like, single subject design? Those are question marks that I'm putting in
question marks.
Yeah.
So from there, we go into chapter 2, which I don't want to spend too long on because I did feel.
Did we define street data?
Well, see, that's the thing that as I was reading this book, the one definition of street data that had been presented, there was some in the foreword, not written by any of the authors. And then there was a brief description of it, or a brief definition of it in chapter 1, which I was left saying, I don't know what the heck
I'm going to read it to you.
Are talking about. It was very vague.
I'm going to read it to you because it's in the glossary. Use your glossary, Rob.
Well, the glossary.
The glossary. The qualitative, systematic, and experiential data that emerges at eye level and on lower frequencies when we train our brains to discern it. Street data is asset-based, building on the tenets of culturally responsive education by helping educators look for what's right in our students, schools, and communities instead of seeking out what's wrong. Street data embodies both an ethos and a change methodology that will transform how we analyze, diagnose, and assess everything from student learning to district improvement to policy. It offers a new way to think about, gather, and make meaning of data.
So that's the only mention of street data, and that's pretty much the definition in chapter 1 that they put in the glossary. And I don't love that definition of street data because I'm left saying, what? I don't. So street data is really great. It's a new way of doing things. That's great. I have no clue. Am I doing it now? Am I street data-ing?
What I thought was most helpful was the diagram that broke down satellite data, and maybe that's in chapter 2.
That's in chapter 3 and 4. Yeah.
Oh, so we're not there yet?
No.
Can I just say it now?
Say it now.
No, yes, I want to come back to it. I don't want to spend a lot of time on chapter 2.
I'm getting a no from the producers.
Hold on.
Okay.
Let's go back to that. I did want to mention in terms of chapter 2. At this point, with that was my only definition of street data, the one that Jackie just read from the glossary. I started chapter 2 and they're like, now we're going to talk about equity and all these traps and tropes of how you can fail at equity. I really felt like I was like, when are we going to get to the fireworks factory, folks? Like, come on, you have to the title is street data, not here's a bunch of ways you're a racist. You got to get to it, right? But having read that chapter, I did feel Alex, give me the finger. Oh, not the finger. He's giving me the I want to say something finger. I did feel that having read this chapter and then read the whole book, there was a real context to everything that was in here that I think also helped me with my idea of sort of where I was in my own anti-racist work, in my own self-reflection, and in thinking critically about my idea of data from my own, historical Western white lens. So I do think there was a lot to be had here, even though we still haven't gotten to the definition of street data at this point in the book.
Hilariously, this is one of my favorite chapters.
Oh, I love this chapter. I did not at first because I wanted to get to a better definition of street. I wanted to get to what do I need to do? Safir and Dugan, let's go. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready.
Okay, now I didn't know say his point.
Well, no, that's the whole thing, is that why give you a definition that you are going to be hostile to because you don't have the appropriate context?
I'm like Neo in the Matrix. I wasn't ready to find out quite yet. I had to get to the end of the movie to learn how to fly.
Question in this one of my favorite discussion question in this section is, what traps and tropes sound or feel familiar to you? And I was like, every single
yeah.
I can give you a definition and an example of every single one of these, which made me sad, right? But I thought this chapter was vital. I wish they actually would have made this chapter 1.
Yeah, you know what? Maybe that would have been helpful.
Chapter 1 was like an introduction. I felt like chapter 1 was our first author, kind of like needing to demonstrate her
bona fides.
Yeah, that's it. Isn't it bona fides?
The bona fide certified.
Yeah, like in Genie in the Lamp.
Genie for Charles Fair. Yeah.
In writing this book, but I agree. Chapter 2 has a lot of great info, which we'll discuss now.
I mean,
and I was just going to say, what I really like about this chapter is it just reminds me, and I know that this is not an uncomplicated or an unmarked analogy, but like practical functional assessment, you can do experimental functional analysis all day long, but you're not going to find out why the little girl keeps swallowing the keys until you go into her house.
Right.
Like Hanley's example of, we never would have figured this out, that every time she swallows the keys, her mom gives her a Coke to calm her stomach. It would have taken it took ages to figure that out. And this is what they're talking about, of like, don't pull kids out. Like, don't be stupid in how you are trying to get data about people. Get data in context, in real time.
Contextual. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's why this chapter is really good and important.
Yeah. So quick definition of equity, because honestly, I appreciated having this, because even having read equity in the title, I sort of thought I knew what it meant. And I wasn't so far off, but I think there was some subtlety that I was completely missing. So this is a quote from page 29. Equity is an approach to ensuring equally high outcomes for all by removing the predictability of success or failure that currently correlates with any racial, social, economic, or cultural factor. So it's something we're working towards in all of our systems, hopefully, but specifically education here, rather than something we're going to reach. We're not going to get to equity. Because a lot of it has to do with the idea that we have systems that are not designed to support all of our learners, that we need to identify the barriers that keep all of our learners from succeeding and disrupt them, and examine our own biases in these systems and focus on the talents that our children bring to us, which Mr. Rogers, I wrote in my notes, Mr. Rogers has been telling us this since the 60s, that we need to care about our children, love them for who they are. And I don't think I understood that at all until the past couple of years, with the idea of like, no, that doesn't just mean like let your kids do whatever they want. That means appreciating the gifts they have and letting them build on those, rather than focusing on how they're not measuring up to an arbitrary system, because that inherently is going to be a racist system based on the majority power dynamic. So I love that definition of equity. And I thought that was, even though it wasn't the definition of street data I wanted yet in the book, was so important to come to first.
Because you need a good definition of equity. One, it just reminded me of the classic picture of the three children at the fence and their different heights. Everyone has a box to see over the fence. Only one of them can. That's equality, because they all have a quality of opportunity, really, not really. And then equity is that if you don't need the box, you don't get the box. But if you need 3 boxes, you get 3 boxes, and everyone can see over the fence. And then the idea of like liberation, which they do talk about in the book, is, do we need the fence at all? Can we just mow it down, like tear down the fence so that it's not an obstacle for anybody and we don't have to worry about boxes anymore?
Great. I love that. I love that picture. I was recently in a class on equity and for graduate programs, and that came up. That picture came up, and it was like the boxes, and then there was like a little man like this to the fence, and it confused everything out of me. I was like, I don't understand. Is that guy supposed to be in the baseball? Like, what's he doing? I didn't know that he was like gonna hit the fence down, and I was like, I don't understand. What's this man? Is he going to hit everybody? Like, is he taking out everyone's knees? And then I actually asked that question, and I felt real dumb, because I'm like with all of like my colleagues, and I'm like, so does this one represent like evil? Like, who's this person? So don't worry.
He was there to knock down the fence.
Yes, but then they told me that, and then I was like, oh, they're like, yeah, you probably should have known that. I'm like, well.
Maybe we can remove some barriers that have been put into place by our structured systems.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So not to go over every definition or every step of this, but the chapter then goes over lots of traps and tropes, and these will come up a lot. These will come up a lot through later chapters in the book, in terms of areas, you're kind of like points of failure. But I love how each of them is just so innocuous seeming in a lot of ways. So I'd love if we could all pick which trap or trope was our quote unquote favorite. I don't need to quote it. I just said it. Our favorite, in the sense of one that either struck a chord with us, that we were being reflective of, or we just thought, gallows humor wise, like, oh man, that's the one we're going to get hung up on, and it's going to be so embarrassing when it happens. Whatever perspective, or however you want to pick your, define your favorites.
All right. My favorite one which I see happens so much, is the spray and pray equity. Where you just hire someone that is an expert in equity to come and do a training for you for 1 hour or 2 hours. And then you're like, we've done it. We're the best. We're all equitable because this one person talked to us for 1 hour.
You know, they had the Independence Day speech and they just galvanized the nation to accomplish the goal.
Yeah. So this one, I feel both resonates behavior analytically, right? And I think it also resonates professionally for me because I think this is how we try to handle problems a lot at the university level. But as behavior analysts, we know that a one-day training isn't enough, right? And that you need follow-up, you need to be observing, you need to be taking the data from the training and then seeing it occur in the natural environment and then providing more follow-up and reinforcement to, strengthen and maintain that behavior. So that one hit me both as a behavior analyst and in my real life. I was like, oh, we've done that. Check.
Mm-hmm.
Mine was the equity warrior, which is maybe a little bit similar, but it was defined as having one person who is like in charge of all of the equity at the organization. So they're like the DEI person and everyone goes to them to discuss and basically put the work of making sure things are equitable onto that person. Very often as well, it may be a person of color who's been hired into that role. So then you're putting the work that should be shared across the agency and should be really the onus on the white people onto this one person of color who's then expected to like fix it for everybody else. So you're really just perpetuating the problems that are already present in the system. And that one really rang true for me. Also included in this is the idea of the great white hope. So then the maybe white folks are trying to like protect the students there and rather than working to make the system better or like individually trying to like quote unquote save the students of color from inequitable situations, but then putting themselves in the position of being a savior rather than making the whole situation more equitable.
I think the tokenizing equity is a really big one because I think that we're guilty of that as a society on every level, every forum.
Yeah.
I find myself instantly withdrawing from like just news articles when it talks about like someone being like the first something to do this one specific thing. And I was like, well, that's great that like there's more opportunity, but that it's not like, and we have equity, like an egalitarian society because of this one like new border. It's just like, no, you like, we should be celebrating when we have hundreds of people that are succeeding in all fields rather than just noting that, oh, no, here's our token example of like progress. And we're just going to talk about that and then move on and not really change anything and let the individuals who want to make progress make the progress. And then to some extent too, again, talking about, and it ties into the equity warrior and the superficial equity of like, just because you're talking about it and you have someone that you identify as working toward it, and maybe even have examples of people who were in the past, like Dr. Dugan would be a great example. If you just like Dr. Dugan, she's going to come in and give us a talk, or she's going to be our like equity person because she grew up under the system and like managed to defeat it. But we're not really going to change anything, but we're going to be proud that Dr. Dugan is a part of our organization.
We'll refer to her if there's a problem and, go talk to Dr. Dugan. I'm sure she'll tell you what to do. It's her job after all. Yeah. So again, I think very good chapter. Like Alan said, you got to go through this chapter. Not every reader, but I think most readers probably need to go through this chapter because you have to have that understanding for what comes next.
And even if you've heard it before, it'll get you all fired up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It can be the hook.
Yeah. Chapter 3. We're finally going to start talking about street data and what it is, with our principles of taking our voices from the margins and bringing them to the center, with our core stance of anti-racism. And this, Diana, like you said, this is the chapter where Dr. Safir and Dugan talk about the idea of our data systems, what are levels of data. So we've got our level 1, which is our satellite data, which is the data that you're going to see in the paper. It's usually the data that's going to talk about how school system X is failing, or how the achievement gap for, students of color is widening. And again, not that this data is necessarily horrible data, or there's never, ever, ever going to be a place for it, but how it isn't going to tell us what we need to do. It is just going to tell us sort of what is bad. It's going to give people the sense that if only the person in charge, who's not actually working with the students themselves, could make a decision, or hire that speaker to come in, or appoint the equity committee to sort of go into a closet and come up with a plan that everyone ignores because it's really hard to do new things sometimes. We're really going to focus on our failure narratives, and then we're going to have information that doesn't really give us any actionable steps, or the steps that are actionable are not necessarily ones that are going to lead to anti-racist behavior on the part of the educators.
Yeah, so these are things like your standardized test scores, your attendance level at school, your graduation rates at school, your parent participation in the school, etc. And for each of those, I think we could point to points of failure in that measurement system and why it may be problematic, right? And it can also lead you to say, oh, well, we see these points of failure and then lay it at the feet of some other cause, right? Like, oh, this is because this district doesn't have a lot of money, for example, but you're not getting to the root of the problem, which are that there are unmet needs.
The parents aren't supporting their children as much as they should be, which is like, it may
that doesn't mean,
but this data doesn't tell us
very
that.
Very unhelpful. Yeah. So
level 2 is our MAP data, it's referred to. So this is data that's collected in the classroom, and this is going to be more like your assessments, your tests, could be student surveys. So, this is getting a little bit closer to getting to the voice of the students or the individuals we're trying to support. Literacy data would be, and again, this is going to give us some information. So again, not horrible data or totally worthless data, but it is really lacking in a lot of context in terms of, we know that some of our students, we can look at the demographics, did poorly on test X or test Y. We don't know why they did poorly. And we could make an assumption, well, they're not studying hard enough, or, oh, I didn't, as the teacher, I didn't teach the material very well. Okay, that's great, but you still don't know, what does that mean? You didn't teach the material very well. How are you going to teach it differently in the future? And odds are, like we're talking about in chapter 2, you're probably going to go back to what you know, which is sort of a Western empirical idea of, you're going to do something different and you're going to test it and see if the scores get better. It's not terrible, but it's not necessarily better, equitable teaching. You're just going to do the same thing, the same sort of inherently racist practices again and again and again until hopefully you get lucky, or everyone graduates because you took too long to actually teach them anything meaningful. Who knows? But it's not really getting at the problem. It's useful, but not solving your problems.
And when you say racist, too, like, just for our listeners, you're not implying that teachers are like inherently overtly racist. But people do carry some maybe unrecognized or latent biases that they haven't fully explored. And that can occur at the individual level. And then at the societal level, we have structural racism that's built into these institutions as well. So that have been
more referring to the latter.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure for our listeners that we clarify.
I do not assume that every teacher is going around telling the students that what they have there is a failure to communicate or anything like that.
Well, but it's important because we learn our individual biases within the culture of a structurally biased society. Mm-hmm. I also want to say that I can tell you exactly from having been a teacher, not just a school consultant, that the kinds of feedback teachers would get in those circumstances, well, why aren't you, just the most stupid, irrelevant feedback from administrators at all levels. Well, if I look back at your review, you didn't post your, like this, what's the word I'm looking for? The standard. And so the students don't know what they're looking to learn. Okay, that's why we as a school are low performing in this test is because teachers aren't posting their standards. That is so stupid and frustrating, but is exactly the conversations that happen week after week after week within public schools currently.
Yeah.
And that doesn't look like a system that is inherently biased or that would be problematic, but it's used to justify the outcomes, and the outcomes are based on systems that are biased. And so it's that is a biased practice. If it doesn't help, it is biased against students.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the anti-racist. It's not just that you're not racist, that you have to be anti-racist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what's important, is that if a practice seems stupid, it's probably stupid and unhelpful and doesn't benefit and is the product of structural bias.
I want to quote you on that one. If a practice seems stupid, it's probably stupid. I really love it.
I was gonna take the second part. Sounded really smart, but I like that you took the first part.
Yeah. But
I love calling practices stupid. It's my favorite thing.
All right. Well, then we move on. Here it is, folks. Street data. And this is if you can guess from sort of the tapering down of where the data are coming from, this is looking at the artifacts, like direct artifacts from our stakeholders. And they use the term, I can't remember if they used the term stakeholder or if I just wrote it in my notes as stakeholder. I think they did, stakeholder. So it is looking at the things our students are doing, the things that they're doing right, the things that are happening that are going well, instead of seeking out what's wrong. So this is getting information about how our students perform in terms of their feelings about the learning environment, looking at what might be impeding their ability to thrive in our environment, looking at instructional activities that might make sense to do based on these findings, and then looking at what are the factors and forces that could impact that do appear to be impacting student learning. So you could look at this from a couple different ways. So, for example, they give an example to kind of lay out how they're different. Your student keeps getting sent out of the classroom to the principal's office. All right, there's a couple ways you could look at that. Your satellite data is going to be how many times has the student gone to the principal's office? Again, that might be helpful in some respects. If we look at it as street data, though, we're going to look at, well, what is the student's immigration status? Is there some sort of a trauma history that the student has based on that status? Does the student done a self-reflection on, issues in school? Have you as the educator done a self-reflection on implicit bias that you might have that's leading to this student being sent to the principal's office over and over? What's the style of education in the classroom? Has the student shared what they like about what they're learning, what they don't like about what they're learning? Have the caregivers of that student done the same? These would all be examples of street data for the same issue, the same topic. In this case, student is going to the principal's office a lot. Okay, great. Looking at the street data piece, you can make more actionable steps that are using the students' lived in experiences rather than just a number. Because if you're just looking at a number, you're not getting the information. And I like this example too, because this is very true to if you're doing like school refusal or if you're doing some sort of a PBIS system. There are going to be data that go into your FBA when the systems aren't working, when you're seeing from their satellite data that, hey, these numbers don't seem to be going down. It's not going to be enough to just set up a new system. You are going to have to include your stakeholders, and your client, your student, in the analysis to determine the factors that are relevant and then make changes to those factors rather than just putting in the new systems. But at the end of the day, it has a lot more to do with the student's voice. What is the student doing in class? What is the student saying about class? What is their work showing about class? What are they saying about their work? But looking at those artifacts rather than just numbers.
I like the other example here that they brought up, where they were talking about like the school district meeting where they show the slide. They're like, we're doing great here, horrible here, horrible here. Mm-hmm. And then all of the parents left the meeting saying like, that's not us. Like, we're not, you don't see us in that data. Like, is our school like the worst school in the world? I see good things that are happening. So that was one of the examples that I really loved in this section that I thought really, it's called Flip the Dashboard for a reason, right? Although this levels of data picture on page 55 looks like poop. Doesn't it a little bit?
A little bit. Yeah, but I think it's
bit.
supposed to be a stack of stones.
I know, but I thought
A
instantly.
cairn, in fact.
Yeah, I was like, why are they putting poop on that? But I think that, I bookmarked that page because I thought, yes, if you're just looking at this data, it doesn't paint the picture that there's real growing and growth going on, and it doesn't depict the friendships and the social emotional learning, right, that's happening in the classroom. And so I thought that was really important to add. And it really, I think, brings it up, highlights the point that it probably isn't putting in like those student-led community walks and, those observations to see what's happening. They say, here are all the things that you can do. Those, I love that they put those first and then put that example, because I was like, oh yeah, I like that.
Well, and that's like an external measure of success. That's like these students are failing in this metric compared to, say, everybody else.
Right.
But in that community, it's like we've all worked really hard, and that's like 10 times better than it was when we were kids.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just telling these people that have had a lot of success in making their communities and their families more successful that, oh, well, all your hard work just not up to snuff. And you're doing that in one graph, and you're doing it, because you're trying to help.
Right.
And you're just being a jackass.
Yeah.
So.
And it all goes back to social validity, right? And we have to determine if the things that we're attempting to change are important, if the way that we're determining if they changed is important. And that can only be determined by listening to other people, the people that matter, the stakeholders here, right? And all of this, I don't know when this episode's coming out, right? But we just had 2 episodes that are really relevant to this conversation. One was with Sandra Bishop talking about trauma-informed care, whatever the title ends up being for that, but it's episode 212. And that episode was all about looking at the contextual histories for individuals who might be coming into our services. And a lot of the pieces that are relevant there could equally be relevant in these conversations, right? Because none of us should be reduced to a data point, and all of our past learning histories, whether they're traumatic or not, are important in understanding how we're behaving currently. And then the other one we recently did, or in my current timeline was recent, is episode 214, which was Jessica Rohr and Mary Jane White talking about compassionate care. And we touched a lot on these same social validity pieces in that conversation as well, because without approaching what we do from that type of compassionate perspective, then we really could be missing the mark. And we know that we're good at what we do, right? But we have to first and foremost decide if what we're doing is worthwhile before we then go ahead and do a good job of it. Because if it wasn't worthwhile, then we didn't do a good job.
And it just makes me think to also go back and look at meaningful differences and be like, how tone deaf are the authors? Like, well-intentioned.
It's a long time ago. But yes.
It was, but we still use, we talk about the 5 million word gap. Like, we still use that language and that context. And some of the information that feels uncomfortable about meaningful differences, about like their sample being like very problematic, considering that they're 2 white like researchers in a predominantly black community. And then they're just like, and these families do this. You're like, like thinking about this book, it's like, if our data and our systems are influenced by this 40-year-old metric of the 5 million word gap, then it's time to move beyond those kinds of things.
Yeah. So in terms of looking at street data, there's so many different examples. We're not going to get into all of them. They focus in kind of the key areas of artifacts, stories and narratives, and observations. We all know observations, but sort of within that, they had a lot of examples in the chapter. I'd love it if we could just share an example, either of an artifact, story, narrative, or an observation. So like a street data example that you liked, either because you said this would be a great one to start with, easy for most educators, or that you thought was something you'd never really thought of as relevant data in looking at student performance.
I don't think my example is from this chapter, so I don't know if it's going to get stricken from the record, but it was underneath the category of stories and narratives, and I believe the character, the student's name was Alyssa in the story, and it was a story of how she got suspended. Right? Do you remember this one, Rob?
Yeah, it was a great one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and whatever had happened was like presented as a relatively minor thing that occurred, and then it just snowballed and snowballed and snowballed from there, and they moved her out of her class with her friends, and she wasn't attending school anymore, and she was getting bad grades, right? And they were really just looking at it as like, you're failing out of class. You're no longer doing your activities, but they weren't looking at the bigger picture of the social anxiety that she was experiencing, and really like basically like the learned helplessness that was going on because all of these things had happened to her for this relatively minor thing. And the relatively minor thing happened or became a big deal because they didn't talk to her about what happened in that
crazy.
scenario. Yeah.
Right?
And
of course they're going to call. Of course they're going to call us. And they never did. And then the other people didn't show up for the mediation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
So it wasn't even on her. Yeah. They wouldn't do the restorative justice, the other party. So she couldn't get credit for doing the restorative justice, like the whole scenario. And I think that was maybe beyond just the street data piece, but if they had addressed it at a street data level.
It was the failure to collect that
exactly.
street data information.
Then yeah, it could have been.
So Diana, I thought that was a great example. Unfortunately, it isn't in chapter 3. So it is, listeners, forget what you heard, strike that from the record. Yeah. It doesn't count. I joke, of course. That is a great example.
Well, I think that touches on, of the 10 that they have in this area, I think the home visits and the shadow a student, those are sort of the two big components that do touch on that of just like, I mean, that was one thing that made me want to leave schools was like, how can I help these students do anything when I can't go into the home, when I can't do anything. My school district was not interested. What's really sad is we had so many of us that were like preparing to be either early childhood educators or BCBAs or some people doing both. And we're like, please let us go once a quarter if families will let us. Like we wanted to go. But it's like, no, can't do that. It's too tricky.
You learn so much by visiting someone's home. Again, if they're like, happy to have you there. And I always encouraged all of my BCBAs to have that experience because you can try to get someone to tell you about like their home life and what that's like. And those are really important pieces of data. But, people don't think about what to tell you because it's their life. They don't necessarily recognize what's maybe an important piece for you as an outsider coming in. But if you can go and you can observe it, then everything makes so much more sense. And it's easy to see what's important to this family, what they value, how their family dynamics are. Even like the layout of their home sometimes is helpful just to know when you're trying to address problem solving things in the future. So it's really meaningful.
It goes back to the one ethical guideline of make environmental changes that make behavior analytic services unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, let's go to a place where let's just make changes that might make further support unnecessary because it's a fix that because I see it and a family is struggling to see it because their context, they may not be able to change it, or may not be willing to change it. But hopefully if I'm there, I'm able to have this conversation. But the shadow a student one is like, especially if you have a student with behavioral challenges, follow them and hear how often they're told no in a day. Just how often they're told no, and be like, would you want to be in this place if all you ever heard was no? You're bored and you ask in a appropriate way for something to do and you're just told no and ignored. I'm not going to be successful in school. So I liked those two types of street data.
Great point.
All right. So we move into our next or Jackie, did you said you already kind of talked. You already talked about yours. So
I already talked about mine.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool. All right. So we move into chapter 4, Pound the Pavement, with the guiding principle of seeking the root cause over quick fixes, which I think should be very true for the behavior analysts listening. and the core stance of deep listening. Sounds like a deep massage. So it sounds great. I love that idea of deep listening. And really, this chapter goes over where does street data fit into an improvement cycle. And the improvement cycle that is espoused here is the equity transformation cycle, which is this idea of kind of these different phases that are circular, that aren't necessarily linear, because you can always kind of go back to some of the previous phases. And the goal is really to look at these sort of short, this short-lived process, short-lived in the sense of it should take about 6 to 8 weeks from the beginning to the end to sort of determine whether it has supported your anti-racist equitable actions or not. And if so, you could do things differently, rather than sort of the standard business model that schools try to solve problems, which is this idea of, and I don't think I'd ever thought of it this way, but it was very true. This is what schools often do, is plan, do, study, act. So y'all sit down, all the stakeholders with the power sit down and say, all right, we need to do something. We need to make a change. Let's all plan what we're going to do differently. Then we're going to do it. Then we'll look at the data that comes from what we did. And there we go. And then we'll continue to act on it, or we'll change it if we need to. And the inherent problem there being that a lot of time those plans, while they might be using data, are not necessarily using data that's relevant to all of the learners. It's the people who are in charge know best. Therefore, they will use the data they think will solve the problem and they think will answer the question, but they may not be asking the right question. So it's just inherently, you're really throwing darts when it comes to making an equitable plan, because you're not including your marginalized voices. Whereas the equity transformation cycle starts with listening, really looking who are our individuals in our most marginalized communities and how are we listening to them, not just gathering data on them, but paying attention to what they're saying about the learning process, what they're not saying about the learning process, what they're expressing non-verbally, and focusing on using this information. So, paying attention to what they're saying rather than transactional listening. You're just like, yep, you have to answer these questions and I'll look at your answers. There's more to it than that. And using that information to kind of go to that next phase. So starting with that listening, then kind of continuing to use that street data, gathering more street data, like some of the examples we've had, to get to this step of reimagining. So getting creative. Okay, now that we have this information, how could we do things differently? It felt like a very blue skying kind of step of changing how school could be done. I really appreciated too how in this chapter, because I think when you read this book, if you've worked with more than just juniors and seniors in high school, a lot of this sounds like, well, this is useless to me. Like, why would I do this with young children, or how would I do this with young children? And I love that this chapter gives an example of how you could use this cycle with kindergarten students, with the example of kids who are always getting in trouble because they won't sit still. How you could listen to them about what could help you sit still, or like, is there a signal I could give when I need everyone to sit still?
No, I loved it. I marked this too. And it's not just that, we need kids to sit still.
No.
Right? So I don't want to give anyone that impression. But it's on page 89. And it says, when you feel wiggly in your body, what kind of movements do you want to make? And they could draw a picture of what it is. And it says, what's great about feeling wiggly and what's difficult about it? And then it says, where and how can we make movements in class so we don't accidentally hurt others, right? So it's not like, everybody's got to sit still all the time. I feel like I'm bringing this up because it's really relevant.
Yes.
For BCBAs out there, right? So it's not that everyone has to sit still all the time. That's the only way that you can learn. But there might be times where if you're too wiggly, then you could hurt someone else, right? Yeah. So then we need to define when and where it's okay.
So, Diana, do you know what's funny about that quote? I actually answered those questions when I read them. I didn't do that for many of the reflection questions, but then I was like, when do I feel wiggly? I'm like, okay, I feel wiggly when I want to prepare. I actually answered the questions. The questions for the kindergartners really spoke to you in this book. Yep, I answered those.
Yeah. I really love this series. And the last one is, what do you want me as a teacher to say or do to help you when you feel wiggly?
Yeah.
I just thought this was really lovely.
Yeah. And that was an example, I think, of a little bit of street data, but more the idea of reimagining. So taking the street data you've been collecting, taking the information that has been gathered, and thinking of, well, there are lots of ways that I could approach this to support, my students from a strength-oriented standpoint, rather than just, all right, now that we have this data, here's the curriculum we're going to be buying.
I think this is the chapter that if you as a BCBA want to incorporate like acceptance and commitment, like these are rather like the defining one's values. Great. The committed action, this equities, these cycles, these processes, using this youth participation, action research that they talk about, like this is those committed actions that you could take. And so like, and basically it's keep your eyes open and your mouth shut for a little while is kind of a big point for someone in an expert scenario, is actually listen rather than just like check your boxes and be like, oh, I did my assessment. No. Like let's actually sit down and zip it and actually see what's going on, see the reality. I also was just thinking that, you know, that this, we talking about like assent in our field. Like we have expectations of what's going to happen. And we need ethically to have our patients, clients, students assent to what we're doing. So what better way than to like, what do you need to make this an enterprise that you will join me in, little guy? Mm-hmm. Like, what will it take? And then let's do that. Mm-hmm. Rather than a reinforcer assessment of like, what candy can I give you to get you to answer my questions? Mm-hmm. It's a, what can I do to make you stay here and stay invested in what we're going to do? Mm-hmm. Harder to do with young children, but not impossible. And we as a field are talking about that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. The final phase in the cycle would be then to move. So, like you just said, Alan, there's the call to action. There's an action component. And I did like the idea of this whole endeavor being one of courageous action. The idea that you're going to do this for a short period of time and that most of the problems you are trying to solve are complex. And I did appreciate how the book differentiated the idea of a complicated problem from a complex problem, because I kept coming back to that idea. You know, the authors say that a complicated problem is one in which the solution is known, but to complete the steps required to reach the solution, there are many, many steps. There are going to be very, very hard steps, but as long as you do them, you will reach the solution. And that problems of equity are not, or building equity, building anti-racist action is not a complicated problem. It's not like we know all the steps and we just have to do them and then it'll all be fine. It's a complex problem in that it is a problem in which the solution is unknown, and that only by taking concerted action will you be able to start getting towards a meaningful solution. And really that idea of you're only going to be able to get so much data, and the data itself may not lead to the exact solution that you're looking for, but that's part of the fact that this is a complex problem you're solving. If it were just complicated, then this would be easy to some extent, because we'd have a book saying like, these are the steps for equity, and you would just follow them and everything would be fine. And we know that's not the case. But many problems are complex. We don't necessarily know the perfect solution. We're going to gather information that will allow us to work towards a solution that, you know, we assume will be more beneficial based on the fact we've collected this meaningful data from the individuals themselves, from their, you know, observable behaviors as well. But we're going to have to act. And there's a good chance, since it's a complex problem, there's going to be resistance to it. But we have to be willing to act, setting small goals so that we can come back and start this process again, kind of continuing to use more data. And I like the cyclical nature of this process in that you can always go back and collect more street data. You could always go back and update your plan and then continue to act again. I do like that, rather than we're just going to do this whole thing and it goes to the end, and at the end we'll say success or fail. And if it's success, we'll just keep doing exactly what we did. If it's fail, we're going to scrap it all. We're going to start all over again.
Using formative assessment rather than summative assessment.
Yeah. Any other steps in the equity transformation cycle chapter that you felt either helped your understanding of what street data are, or that you felt were helpful in terms of thinking of sort of procedural processes that we as BCBAs could be doing differently?
No.
Okay. I feel like we kind of talked about that like, this knowing one's values and ethical practices and actually wanting to be in it and doing the right thing rather than the thing that we as experts know to be right. Mm-hmm. Take a step back from that approach and move, as they say. Use their call to action steps.
Yep. So at this point on, we get to the last two sections of the book, part 3, deep in the learning, and then part 4.
Not a street metaphor, unfortunately.
It was not a street metaphor. And then part 4, transform the culture. And I think this is where the book starts being less applicable if you are not actively using what is in this book, or if you're not actively working in a school system. Not that there aren't, I think, really important nuggets or pieces that you could use in your work as a behavior analyst, but it does become more about the direct steps that your educational team or your building-based team or whichever team would probably need to take. So looking a lot more at the ideas of student agency, student voice, which I think that's pretty important. But really, as an educator, there's some kind of general rules. We can go over those real quick. And then the chapter that I thought was of the two really important was looking at what are the values of your school, because you should be focusing on doing less well than trying to do everything. You should have a level of focus, and it really should be a component of your school's plan. You know, your graduation plan, your portrait of a graduate. I know a lot of districts have these now. Our local district has one, and these should always be speaking to the values of your learners, of your community, and that's going to guide a lot of your street data. So if you're not sure what street data you need, well, if you don't have a goal for your graduates, it's going to be a lot harder to collect meaningful street data because you sort of don't know what it is your school, your community is trying to accomplish. Perhaps you should do some initial community interviews, figure that out first, and they tell you a little bit about that process so that you can link all of this together. So everything, there should be less focus, but everything needs to be somewhat connected, and you need to be collecting information in the form of mostly street data to gather whether or not your students are able to reach those goals. And if they're not, what's not going well? Like where are the disconnects? How are you not supporting the students in learning and reaching those goals? Are they relevant goals? Even then being the question.
I would say that this section is actually more relevant than that. Mm-hmm. In that we, like the four of us, we are in a position where at least sometimes we come into contact with major stakeholders in this conversation. And if we're not willing to spend the time to be convinced by these sections of this is how you actually do it, then how will we combat the structural bias when we're talking to people who can make the change and say, well, we're doing a standardized assessment. Why? Standardized assessment's awful. And then it's well, what should we do instead? Wait, we this gives us a starting point to draw from to talk about, well, we should be abandoning big data and standardized testing in favor of these models. So there is utility beyond, it's just harder to access if you're not actively using it. But there is a point to it, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Alan. And I mean, certainly in my current role, I found this to be very useful. I was worried that if you were not actively teaching, some of these terms or some of the practice steps wouldn't feel actionable or would feel confusing. But I think you make a good point that if we are talking to stakeholders and we don't have more of the solution than just some general terms, you're right. It is going to sort of devalue everything that's come before. So that is a very good point.
Well, I guess I don't know what the percentage of our listeners are who are professors. It might be small, but for me, these two chapters were highly relevant, and Jackie's nodding her head as well. So yeah, I loved in chapter 6, that's where they do the student profile, right? Mm-hmm. And just as an aside, I think that you definitely want your profile of a student as a young person to be more cohesive and coherent than your portrait of an artist as a young man. Mm-hmm. That's just some James Joyce humor for all of you out there. So I was like, oh yeah, like this is great. There's some very nice diagrams in chapter 6. And then in chapter 5, that's where they go through and give you, we're talking about the application piece. They give you like so many great examples of how you can really provide opportunity for student voice within your classroom, and thinking about ways in which you can diversify the learning experiences for your student and ensure that you have opportunities for them to have more of an experiential learning process versus just the teacher who's going to, drone on about the material. And we should be regularly, actively gathering feedback from our students about what that experience is like for them so that we can continually better the overall learning experience for them. So for me, this was really, really highly relevant, and I loved chapter 5. What about you, Jackie?
That's what I was going to say when I opened my mouth, but then you had your mouth open too, so I just let you go for it.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's my bedtime. So, but yeah, I took notes and like added it in my syllabi, added it in PowerPoints for my class experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know there are some rules that are placed here to discuss how you can, while these are not simple rules, they were referred to as simplexity. So they were some core rules that you could focus on to deal with complex situations. Because, at the core of a lot of this, at least chapter 5, or I think the entire book, was the idea of student voice and our goal of teaching students to question and challenge the status quo, which to me always felt like, well, that seems very limited, just teaching them how to speak to government bodies. But that really, when you're talking about challenging the status quo, it's more asking questions about what's going on around you and then learning about it so that you can affect change according to your values, rather than just like, I just need to get my degree in social protest. Like that's not it. I'm narrow. I'm being too narrow when I hear challenge the status quo. I get very narrow in terms of, well, you're going to learn to be like a protester. That doesn't seem like a very lucrative career. I don't know. That's not really what it is.
Social change.
I would just say that this is a great opportunity, like I've brought up before, that if you're not on TikTok, get on TikTok. Because there are the soft parenting community, Gen Z as they come of age. Like, this stuff is happening, and these authors are just suggesting ways to do it in a more cohesive way that can affect change. Because that's the thing. We are 4 white people talking about systems developed by people of color. Well, I can tell you they've been working. Everything that I've learned from my friends and my community, as I've learned to be like, okay, I really need to sit down and shut up and listen and learn, is that they've been trying to say this. People have been trying to say this for ages. And it's sad that it's just happening now. But it is happening, and it's exciting. And if you want to know more, it's happening in a very public space that we don't credit as valid because it's social media. But go look, like, be part of be a listener. And if you're invited to be part of the conversation, do it. And that's a great place to do it. Because so much of what this book talks about in these sections, you can see in like the soft parenting conversations, and talking about like hearing Gen Z and younger millennials, and heck, even Gen Xers talking about why was school so useless to me?
Yeah.
The ADHD community, the autism community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of street data to be had.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good. And then the other thing, and this will be, I don't know, to me, this is where I want to steer the conversation a little bit, is I'm reading all this. I'm like, yes, chapter 5, chapter 6, I am there for it. I want to make sure I'm doing all these things. But as an educator, I also have this barrier that I need to get my students over, which is they got to pass the BCBA exam at the end of all of this, right? And I can't change that exam. And there are situations where I have, students who probably would be amazing BCBAs, but I know that test taking is going to be really challenging for them. And I can't do anything about that piece, right? So there are times in class where maybe I want to be working to incorporate all of these like fight the system type of things, but I also got to make sure they know the definitions in Cooper. So like, where's the balance between those two, and how can I make sure that I'm, hitting it in the right way?
Well, the fact that it's a multiple choice test, I would like to think that if you're looking at experiential,
you're missing the point, Rob.
That's the test. But if you're focusing on student experience, I would hope that in the current, with those, those specific barriers to what you can and cannot teach, I would hope that some of that information would still allow for being able to, be utilized in that setting, even if it is inherently not the way you would want them to be tested on their ability.
I think, Diane, what you could just say, I think this is where I was going, is you could just say, this is bias and this is awful. And like, we have to get beyond this. This is the state of our field. And I have to teach you these things because I want you to become a successful behavior analyst so that you can then change it to a more equitable system.
Yeah.
I think that is something that you can do, is just admit that there's a problem.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
So, and that's a great, perhaps, point to wrap up on.
Yeah. So we went over kind of this last chapter. The last section, I think, is definitely more for the lead. If you're working in administrative or you're a leader in your district. So a lot to be had there to become the warm demander. I really loved that chapter. Just really briefly to say that I did like the idea of the examples they gave. A lot more anecdotes, I think, because they knew there'd be more teachers reading this than administrators. But the idea of, hey, guess what, administrator, you're going to have situations in which team members aren't quite on the same page as you and the rest of your community, or they are and they make a mistake and they hurt someone inadvertently. That doesn't mean that they, even if they didn't mean to do it, you still have to follow up on it. But using a lot of what you learned throughout the book to sort of be that warm demander of, I expect better from everybody, but it's not a matter of you messed up and now you're fired and you're in trouble. It's a matter of using some of that street data to determine, well, what went wrong? How could you do it differently? And I'm sure there are situations where you could get the person like, I hate this stuff and I'll never do it differently. And okay, well, maybe you're not going to have the great outcome of the anecdote in the book, but that same idea, the leader is doing the same process with the educators as the educators are doing with the students of, giving them the opportunity to use what they've learned, giving them the opportunity to answer and ask questions about what's going on, to come up with actions rather than just telling them, here's how to be equitable. Do these 5 things and then you'll be an equitable educator and you never have to do anything different. And I did love that as really speaking to the idea of this as an ongoing process rather than a sort of single arrow-driven, goal-oriented process. If we're going to reach this goal of equity and then we've done it and then we can move on to improving our test scores. But first equity, then test score. Like that's not the point. But again, if you're not an administrator or a leader, some of those chapters may feel a little repetitive because it is going over a lot of the same concepts and material. And then the book ends, and it has a nice, I thought a nice ending, even as a slight textbook. I do appreciate when a book bothers to write an ending to itself. So thank you very much, Dr. Safir, Dr. Dugan, for having an epilogue with a quote. I always love an epilogue with a quote. Deeper learning requires first that we listen deeply is part of that quote. So, but you can go read the quote yourself to see that wrap up.
I like the appendices. Right?
Oh, yes.
Right. If you're going to actually do this, you're going to need the appendices, the appendices to help you. Right. Mm-hmm. Because there's rubrics. Right. There's looking at how you can do instructional rounds. It's really good. It's like copy right out of the book and go onto the floor.
Yeah.
And if you like it as a BCBA, find a way to make it behavior analytic.
Yeah. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. Good stuff. It is on us not to just get, it's behavior analytic because it's done by BCBA. It's like, no, this seems good. This seems worth me figuring out how to make it work within my context.
Yeah. And you know what, Alan, I think that's a great place for us to kind of wrap up with, the book. So it's kind of our final thoughts and what this means to the community at large. And I think I'd like to say, as someone who's still working in the public schools, I was very excited by this book. I was excited at how it challenged me as a white white guy, and my own process and my own
white
journey.
Old guy.
I'm a white old guy. Yeah, TikTok. What? No, thank you. I don't think so, Alan. Get your youth culture out of my podcast, please. But I appreciated that it challenged me. I appreciated that it gave me more to do in my own work. And I was excited. I was excited to both agree and disagree. And they get to think about, why am I worried about this? Why is this making me feel this way? Because I don't get to do that a lot necessarily with all the research, because usually if I disagree, it's from a very specific, these graphs are, I don't think these graphs, what they say are the results matches the graph. It's very analytical in that regard, very specific. And this was less so. Though no less requiring of analysis and of reflection. I think being in a school, I immediately was like, oh man, we got to do the professional development book club at the school, which I think misses some of the point of it. But I want everyone to be thinking about this. I did a class a couple of years ago on setting up data systems, and it was not meant to be an equitable process. It was more meant to come at it from the kind of the Western viewpoint of like, let's look at our big data and then break down and look at aggregate data. But even though I don't think it had that same goal, it did have a number of the same mechanisms, which is we need to be looking at more disaggregated and individualized data. And we need systems that support the gathering and valuing of this data. I feel as a BCBA, just on its face, I think surface level, much of what's in this book goes along with our ethical code in terms of including our clients and including their goals. And like you were talking about, that ascent, including that in the process. Why isn't education any different? And really coming back to the idea of, what are we trying to teach kids? Do we just want them to learn a bunch of rote facts that they can recite back to us and that may or may not be of value to them for the rest of their lives? Or are we trying to teach them to focus on what's important and valuable for them, so that they can learn more information, so that they can act on that information, and so that they can make important changes in their own lives and in the lives of their communities that may not be the ones we were planning on, but we helped them develop those skills. That's what I see the point of education as being, not just you've got to learn these 100 things and then hopefully that will benefit the rest of your life. So I think there's a lot here, and it was just the whole process, I think, very exciting to learn about. I'd like to kind of come back to this one as the school year starts.
Me too. That's what I got to say. I think you summed it up nicely.
I remember learning about derivatives, finding the area under the curve. That's really served me well.
We all had fun. We all enjoyed trigonometry, I'm sure. Yeah. But how much do we use it day to day?
Every day.
Well, I think that this book is great if you are an educator looking to continue your education. Because I don't know about you, but I know that, personally and in Rob's district, there's only like a few structured continuing education opportunities that are usually provided to the educators. And it may or may not be on this type of topic. And this may be one that an administrator could look at this book and say, that seems like a lot to try to tackle in a half-day professional development seminar. I might pick something simpler. So if you're really looking to stretch your own understanding, and if some of the terms here you want to know more about and you haven't heard them before, then this is a really good book to read and potentially challenge yourself in your way of thinking.
I write that. I know they're supposed to be anonymous, but every time I've been given a survey, probably for the past 10 to 12 years of my career in schools, when they say, what did you think about PD this year? What did you think about the PD speaker? I always put in the comments, usually I like the speaker because you can get a good speaker. It's like, I like this topic. Why don't we do an entire year devoted on just this topic? Why aren't we doing workshops? Why aren't we getting together with other educators at our various grade levels or age levels or cross-disciplinary and meeting and reflecting and discuss, like bare minimum, just being, hey, did you try any of the things that were at that talk back in September? Yeah, I did. I tried this and I thought it was great. That'd be a bare minimum. And sometimes you get the sense it's happening, but a lot of times it's just, didn't you love that speaker? How's that going to change your practice? Oh, well, tomorrow I'm going to go in and try one of these things. And then I'm going to forget about it because I'm going to remember every other barrier I have to changing my behavior. And I'm just going to do what's not easiest because I don't care, but easiest because I got a lot of demands placed on my time and I can't do everything.
Well, this book has, things that you as an individual educator can do, as well as, systems level change that you would need to, if you were an individual educator, bring up to the administrative bodies at your school and push for. So at some point along that continuum, you may find the entry point for you, and then you can start there and work towards as much meaningful change as you can produce. Alan?
Oh, I just was going to quote the book and say that the biggest mistake we can make is to cling to the status quo. And
yeah. Great quote.
Very true.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you all, everyone, for being here. We're going to wrap up and then I'll cut the recording and then we'll have some fun end matter. But thank you, Alan. Thank you, Jackie. And thank you, Diana, for all of your thoughtful insights on this discussion of street data. Once again, I want to thank everyone so very much for listening to our Street Data podcast. If you listen to it, it means you are a Patreon subscriber, and we really, really want to thank you for joining us and for subscribing. We hope you enjoy all of the extra content that we put out through here, as well as the discounts on CEs. Thank you so very, very much. Just as a quick heads up, our fall book club will not actually be voted on by listeners because it is for Supervision September. So we have that coming out right away. But again, just like for this episode, you're going to be able to access it ahead of time, and you're going to be able to get 2 free CEs for listening to it as a big thank you for being a subscriber. You probably want to get the second secret code word now, don't you? And it is Dipper, DIPPER. It could be the big or little dipper up in the sky. It could be Dipper from the show Gravity Falls, or it could be Dipper, my brother's dog, who maybe was sitting near me when I was writing down possible code words. Who knows? In any case, you just need to remember the code word is Dipper. And don't forget, as a Patreon subscriber, you also need to go to the original post for this episode, which will be linked in the podcast player app, or you can just go to the patreon.com/ABA Inside Track page for this episode to get access to the extra code. You're going to want to enter this at checkout to get your 2 CEs for no additional charge. And again, thank you so much for subscribing. We hope you enjoyed this season's, our summer Street Data book club. We'll see you back here in the fall for another book club episode. Keep responding. Bye.